Hi everyone, welcome to episode 17 of my Stuarts vlog. We've reached theme 4, which is about the economy, and you'll be asked questions here about why the economy improves through the Stuart era, because that is an accepted historical fact. You're likely, most likely to get questions that ask you to compare one factor to another. You might get asked questions about the domestic or the overseas economy separately, so do be aware of that distinction, or you might get asked about that all in together. You possibly could get a question about the significance of one part of the economy, and there you would still actually be, because it's a significance question, you would still be able to compare that to other factors. And the only other thing that they might perhaps do, which I haven't seen before, would be to say, talk about change and continuity. And there you'd have to think about how things were earlier in the century and compare those to later on in the century. But that shouldn't cause you too much grief either. I would say that if you learn this is actually quite a straightforward topic or theme to unpick, because it's quite contained. So we're going to look in this vlog at the old staples of the economy, agriculture and the cloth trade, and then next time we'll consider the other half of the domestic economy, the growth of London and the rise of banking and insurance, which are together these four areas make up the domestic economy as far as the exam board are concerned. Just to start off with, just though to talk about the kind of contrast in the picture of where we're going, Angela Anderson pulls this out really nicely in her book. She makes the point that in 1600, England was completely, really, in terms of exports, completely reliant on the woolen cloth trade, and had only one major city, London, and no overseas colonies, and was actually in quite a sort of, by European standards, quite a modest economy. By 1714, which is kind of the end of the whole sort of the era, really, even though we finished in 1700. So England, of course, had a number of colonies, quite a dominant navy, a number of exports, not just cloth, and including there the re-export of goods from the colonies, which driven it to become the world economic power. Alongside that, in this period, you also see the kind of the England overtaking the Dutch, and therefore, kind of becoming the dominant force. So the question really is why does that happen, and what leads to it? And the first place I would go for an answer there is agriculture. For me, it seems like agriculture is the base of the economy. If you can't feed people, then you don't have a growing economy. And the ability of agriculture to provide food for growing urban centres where other trades can happen is actually a key element. So I would say that if agriculture doesn't improve and get better, then none of the other factors in the economy can actually improve or even take place. So why does agriculture improve? Well, there are a couple of three, I would suggest, main reasons for this. The first one is to do with rising literacy rates, which allow for the spread of new ideas. Two examples of that, of new ideas. There have been books published before about agriculture, but they don't seem to have had as much impact. In the 17th century, books are written and they seem to have been read and absorbed, and then the advice followed. Two examples of books were written in 1652 or published in 1652. So Richard Weston's book, A Discourse on Husbandry in Brabant and Flanders. So it sounds like an exciting read. Brabant, B-R-A-B-A-N-T, and Flanders. You might better call it just A Discourse on Husbandry. And then slightly more catchily titled, in 1669, John Worlidge, W-O-R-L-I-D-G-E, wrote a book called System Agriculturae. In fact, Systema, S-Y-S-T-E-M-A, and then agriculture, but at the end, or A-G-R-I-C-U-L-T-U-R-A-E on the end. I guess it's a kind of a Latinism. These new ideas included things like new farming techniques, crop rotation, the idea of taking different things out of the soil at different years and allowing it to recover in the years in between, or even kind of leaving it fallow for a year. The use of nitrogen-rich crops like clover, the use of new crops, the frost-resistant turnip, which is my favourite, but also other root crops like potatoes and carrots. Turnips were important because they were used as a fodder crop, and that led to a kind of a second area of development, alongside actually the development of water meadows, the sort of not really flooding of fields, but the watering of fields through the winter, which protected them from the frost and allowed for grazing to happen all year round. That, alongside these fodder crops like clover and the turnip, meant that animals could be kept alive, or more animals could be sustained on a year-round basis. Because of that, I can tell you that the number of horses increased from 300,000, about 300,000 in 1600, to 630,000 in 1700. And of course, the amount of sheep also that can be kept grows as well, and that stimulates the cloth trade too. So the ideas that were put about by Richard Weston and John Woolridge were kind of already around, but they gathered pace, particularly in the second half of the 17th century. So that's one reason that things change. And the second reason is to do with enclosures. In fact, I'll come back to that. That's the third reason. The second reason, I think, is to do with the accessibility or the ability of farmers to access capital investment. That's linked to enclosure because what it allows them to do is to borrow money to buy up land and create bigger farms. In fact, I can tell you that large farms do better, particularly in the second half of the century. Small farms were kind of still more prominent in the north and southwest, but in the south and southeast, larger farms became the norm, and in the Midlands. So by 1700, over half of agricultural land in the Midlands were parts of estates of 100 acres or more, compared to about a third in 1600. So that's growing from a third to over half across the century. Some farms in East Anglia were now up to 500 acres by the end of our period. So the growth of big farms enabled greater efficiency and also greater experimentation, that people could use part of their farm for experimenting with different crops without risking their whole crop and their whole livelihood. That links, as I say, to my third reason for change, and that's enclosure. This is linked to the capital investment because, as I say, they needed the money to kind of buy off farmers. But enclosure is exactly what it says on the tin, really. Instead of having strip farming, like the old sort of year 8 model, where there are 3 big fields around the village and everyone has a line or two in each field, this was fields like we see it today, that they bought the land up and they put a fence or a hedge around it and farmed that on its own. What this meant was that the farmer had much more control over what they farmed, what they grew, or what they kept. So they could keep sheep, which was cheaper and more efficient. You only need one shepherd, a couple of dogs to look after that, whereas farming crops is a bit more intensive and perhaps a bit more risky. That also, of course, allowed for greater specialisation of farming. And that grows in part because national markets start to grow up due to better communications and the growth of London and so on and so forth. And that meant that in the wetter areas of the country, in the north and the west, still today really, sheep and cow farming were more prominent. And particularly in East Anglia and in the southeast, they were kind of more crop farming. The southeast was particularly suitable for wheat, hops, and hemp, because of the warmer conditions and the depth of the soil. That again meant that crops were more efficient, that farmers were able to make more money, and that allows them to pay off the loans that they've got, but also to put in greater investment. So the impact of this was a rise in production, but the impact of this was also, of course, that there were fewer farms in total in England, and smaller farmers tended to be the ones that suffered. As a result, of course, some of them sell their land and move to town and look for employment opportunities there. Some of them supplement their income by getting involved in the cloth trade. By 1700, there were 250,000 people in the country involved in skilled crafts. The Settlement Act actually made it easier as well to employ kind of roaming labour. But also, I can tell you that by 1688, there were 364,000 agricultural worker families, which would equate to well over 1 million people being employed on farms. Now, that's a shift, because in the past, everyone would have their own bit of land, or would rent their own bit of land, or kind of work for their own bit of land, or almost everyone. Whereas what we're moving to now is an economy where people can be hired and paid to work on the land. But of course, what that means is in a bad year, or if situations change or the crops change, people can also be let go, and you can save money on your farm by being more efficient and more effective. So, just in summary, the agriculture, big changes, slightly controversial changes, but effective changes that allow agriculture to grow and develop and be more effective and efficient, even though we have relatively few kind of national figures for production. Secondly, and more briefly, the cloth trade. The cloth trade was England's biggest export trade by a long way. In fact, I can tell you that in 1640, 92% of exports from London were cloth. And that even by 1660, even though the economy is growing, even in 1660, the cloth accounted for 74% of exports. And in fact, in 1700, it was still 72% of exports. That is not because cloth is in decline. That's because other products are now competing, and so there are a greater variety of exports, but cloth retains that kind of dominant position. In fact, between 1560 and 1660, the value of cloth exports grew from 600,000 to 1.5 million. That's almost trebling in the value of the exports. And the reason for this was that despite some kind of early problems in the cloth trade, and the 30 Years' War, which starts in 1618 and runs through to 1648, obviously 30 Years' War, it disrupts exports, and also the cocaine project, cocaine, Cockayne. In fact, that comes before our course starts in 1614. William Cockayne had a bright idea which went kind of badly wrong and ended up really in a trade war with the Dutch. The impact of that is that the Dutch refused to buy finished English cloth, and export prices are affected really into the 1640s. So actually, the first period of our time is a time where things are kind of hard for the cloth trade, and it just gets better and better through the period that we're looking at for them. Partly that's because one impact of the 30 Years' War was that Protestants started moving to England. In fact, there were 4,000 Dutch immigrants who came mostly to Norwich and Colchester in the early 17th century as a result of being forced out of their lands, their homes on the continent, or being fearful for their lives on the continent. That meant the impact of that was that there were greater numbers of people employed in the cloth trade. In Colchester, those employed in the textiles industry rose from just over a quarter, 26.4% in 1619, to 40% by the end of the century in 1699. So it rose from about a quarter to 40%. So more people employed. It led to better techniques. The introduction of the Dutch loom, which was helpful, better and smaller. And also the introduction of just kind of new cloths, the new draperies is what they're known as. And that's just a phrase really for a better type of cloth. The old draperies were heavier woolen cloths, worsted cloths, and the new cloths some of them were kind of mixed with silk. They were lighter and they were worth more. And that meant that the trade, of course, the value of the trade grew. They were based really in East Anglia, but later on the north and the west, particularly as around Manchester, kind of become centres of the cloth trade too. As well as the cloth trade, other things are kind of stimulated by similar circumstances. Lace making in Nottingham, silk production in Spitalfields in London, particularly helped by the French Protestants who come over, the Huguenots, and even other trades. An example that was in, I think, the Angela Anderson book was pin making, which seems a bit obscure, but pin making originally grew as part of the cloth trade and develops into a trade and an industry of its own. And again, Dutch techniques help the pin makers, and that starts off in East Anglia but then spreads to the Forest of Dean. So cloth trade is a huge thing. Its advantage, if you want to say that this is the biggest and most important thing in the economy, is that it's the most valuable export, the dominant export. And if you see that as being the key to England's growing economy, then the cloth trade is your go-to answer. Next time, we'll consider the impact of London and banking and insurance. But I hope that's helpful on the old staples, agriculture and cloth trade. And yeah, that's it. That's all I have to say about that. See you soon.